Good day. Today, 27th May, we see a continued acceleration of the tempo of events on the military fronts in Ukraine and also an acceleration of the political developments, not just in connection to the Ukrainian conflict, but around the world. And of course, all these events are intimately connected to each other. Let's begin with the events on the ground in Ukraine, because of course they are the ones that ultimately drive the entire conflict, the entire situation. They lead, if one wishes to say it, to put it this way, also to that acceleration of political events also. And here I think the first thing to say is that it is all but impossible now to find a serious analyst anywhere, including in the West, who doubts anymore that Russia is winning the war. There is still some question about how quickly that war will be won, and there is also considerable questions about whether it might be possible in some way to retrieve a looming defeat and to convert it into some kind of victory. You do get articles like that. I will come to that. I will come to them soon. But overall, I don't think anybody, any serious analyst, any longer believes that Ukraine is winning the war. What they were all saying in the autumn of 2022 and the first few weeks of 2023, in the run-up to the Ukrainian summer offensive, what in fact they'd been saying directly after the events in Kiev in the spring of 2022 also. So where are we? And I'm going to do as quick a summary of the military situation as I can. The Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with its own update of the military strikes on Ukrainian positions, the missile strikes on the Ukrainians that I discussed yesterday in my program. It hasn't told us a huge amount. In fact, as always, the Russian Defense Ministry is rather clipped and brief in what it says, but overall it's clear that the missile strikes were basically directed at the air defense facilities of Ukraine, at the air bases in Ukraine, and appear to have been principally focused on Starokonstantinov, the air base there. And it's interesting, if one goes to the Russian Defense Ministry updates, that they no longer seem to give quite the same weight in their reporting to the missile strikes. The places where they used to discuss missile strikes have now been replaced with discussions of the operations in Kharkiv region. So it's with these that I'm really going to proceed in my discussion from now on. Firstly, as I said in my program yesterday, I've been hearing an awful lot about Ukrainian counterattacks in Volchansk and Lipsy, the two places where fighting is ongoing in Kharkiv region. There'd been lots of talk that the Ukrainians were putting together large forces in the area of these two places and were seeking to counterattack. And I said yesterday that maybe counterattacks had happened, but reports that I was starting to see seemed to suggest that if Ukrainian counterattacks did take place, they weren't successful, and that it was, in fact, the Russians, on the contrary, who appeared to be gaining ground. Well, late yesterday, we got film from Volchansk specifically, and that film did indeed confirm Russian progress. The Russians appear to have captured another important Ukrainian fortified position in Volchansk. This, it should be said, is north of the Volcha River, but the Russians seem to be making progress, and they seem to be occupying Ukrainian positions, and they seem to be gradually increasing their area of control in Volchansk. There's been a number of commentaries about this now on Russian Telegram channels, and by the way, on the part of Redovka, Russian newspaper. Also, they also talk about the massive damage being done to Ukrainian artillery forces in Kharkiv region, and how Ukrainian armored vehicles are now regularly destroyed by the Russians when they tried to move to Volchansk by road. There's apparently only one road easily accessible to the Ukrainians now, leading to Volchansk, and the Russians have in effect fire control over it. So maybe the Ukrainians still do plan counterattacks in the Lipsy-Volchansk area, but for the moment, the overall initiative still seems to be very much with the Russians. And I'm going to suggest that if and when the Russians do start moving forward purposefully, both towards Lipsy and towards Volchansk, and when they do eventually capture these two villages, the village, Lipsy, and the town, Volchansk, the fact that we've been hearing so much by the Ukrainians about how they've successfully stabilized the situation in these two places, when the collapse comes, it will be another heavy psychological blow at a time when Ukraine's military is already, by all accounts, becoming increasingly demoralized. Now, there were reports yesterday of some kind of border clashes in the Sumy region. It looks to me that these were border clashes between Ukrainian forces and a Russian reconnaissance unit, rather than an outright crossing of the border by the Russians in force in Sumy region. But we'll have to wait and see and track the developments as they happen. Elsewhere on the line of contact, in the main battlefronts in Donbass, the story remains one of Russian advances. Now, this morning, after having confirmed yesterday that the village of Berestovoy had been captured in the Kupiansk area, the Russian Defense Ministry also confirmed the capture in the Kupiansk area of the village of Ivanka. And there have been more reports today of further Russian advances, that the Russians are pushing hard to capture still more places in Kupiansk region. I am not going to pretend that I fully understand the nature of the fighting that is taking place here, but suffice to say that from what I can see, the Russians look like they are gradually clearing the territories to the east of the river, the rivers, the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, and that seems to be the overall priority. The Russians, interestingly, are claiming that a large number of Ukrainian troops were captured, surrendered over the course of the fall of Berestovoye. This is in Kupiansk region. And we've had this from Viktor Volodyatsky, the Duma official, the official of the Russian State Duma, who coordinates contacts with the government of the Lugansk People's Republic. And he has said that over 73 Ukrainian soldiers surrendered in Berestovoye. That is a very large number of Ukrainian troops surrendering in one place. It sounds like a company of Ukrainian troops in Berestovoye basically decided that they were no longer going to keep fighting and surrendered en masse. There have been a few mass surrenders like this. There was one of the 25th Assault Brigade in the area, as I remember, of Pervomaisky in the Avdiivka area. Supposedly up to 200 men surrendered in that particular area. But anyway, 73, which is what Volodyatsky is saying, is a significant number of surrenders in one place over the course of one battle, at least by the standards of this war. And again, this is starting to look a little like a trend. So the Kupiansk area, Russians appear to have captured, have confirmed their capture of various villages, strategic villages. They look like they're about to attack and probably capture another important village in this area as well. And we see that Ukrainian troops, according to the Russians, are starting to surrender en masse. Anyway, that's the reports we've been getting. There's also more reports from Chasiv Yar. I am going to suggest that it is in fact in Chasiv Yar that the main fighting is taking place. This is rather say the main fighting, the most intense fighting of the war is currently taking place. It is on an immensely fierce scale. Again, it's clear that the Russians now do control several buildings or some sections, perhaps half, according to some claims, of the micro-district to the east of the aqueduct. And, well, we've had all those reports that the Russians have reached the aqueduct to the north of Chasiv Yar, and that they've crossed the aqueduct and entrenched themselves in the Novi micro-district to the west of Krasnodar, of Chasiv Yar. It's not clear to me that this is actually, well, so far there's little precise confirmation of this, but it's plausible that these claims are true. And there is no doubt at all that the Russians now control large stretches of the eastern side of the aqueduct to the south of Chasiv Yar, and with the fall of Klashevka and Andreevka and the capture of the fields lying immediately to the east of the aqueduct, the Russians will soon control even more of this territory as well. Now, I read somewhere amongst the myriad of articles that I read every day in the Western media an account by Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting in Chasiv Yar, and they point to an increasingly bleak picture. The Russians having basically full air control. Their drones have swamped Ukraine's drones, the Ukrainian drones in this area. Their air force operates at will over Chasiv Yar. Air defenses, Ukrainian air defenses barely exist. And again, I noticed that there were complaints, concerns about the power of the Russian artillery. Now, there's been a recent report that's appeared in the West that the Russians are producing 4.5 million shells, are likely to produce 4.5 million shells this year. And I believe that this is about right. This squares with my own estimates, by the way, from various figures. that I've been seeing, 4.5 million shells. They're saying that this is 3 times more than the entire collective West is producing. Actually, I think that overstates the number of shells the collective West is actually producing. It assumes a united production across the West of 1.3 million shells. I believe the actual figure is well below that. I think it is probably more like 700,000 or 800,000. Just saying. But anyway, 4.5 million shells gives the Russians the ability to fire around 12,000 shells a day out of current production. Probably on most days they fire rather less than that. Some reports say that they fire around 10,000 shells a day, in which case the Russians would be able to stockpile. For the record, I don't think that this is the limit. We've yet reached the limit of the number of shells in any one year that Russia can produce. 4.5 million shells at the moment. I suspect that by next year, Russia will be producing around 5 million shells and might start even to go above that. Of course, that's assuming the war continues next year. But anyway, it seems that Ukrainian soldiers in Chasiv Yar, obviously, they don't like being bombed by these massive FAD bombs, but the bombs are mainly used by the Russians to destroy fortified positions. It's the artillery, the Russian artillery, and of course the Russian drones that target Ukrainian troops in the field, and that artillery remains as devastating as it has been at all points in the war. So anyway, whatever the exact tactical situation in Chasiv Yar, which I'm not able to assess myself, I'm not, as I said, on the ground, I'm not talking to any of the commanders there, but whatever the exact tactical situation in Chasiv Yar, there is no doubt at all about the direction of travel. The Russians have the city in a tight grip. They're bombing and shelling it relentlessly. They're strengthening their positions on the flanks. They are preparing for advances across the aqueduct and attacks at the city, at the town, from north and south. And they are busy reducing the micro-district to the east of the canal, where Ukrainian troops, some of Ukraine's best troops, are based, and where they are, and where which troops obviously have been largely trapped, but where the Russians continue to apply unrelenting pressure. My own view is that what is currently holding up Russian advances towards Chasiv Yar is the resistance in the micro-district. Once that collapses, which it will, then the major Russian attack on the rest of Chasiv Yar, west of the aqueduct, will begin in force. Anyway, that's a terrible situation, but perhaps even more critical for Ukraine is the crisis in the Avdiivka-Ocheretino area, and there the Russians have this morning announced the capture of another village, which is Netailovo, and another of our endless gallery of Russian officials has been speaking about this. This is Igor Kimakovsky, an advisor to Denis Pushilin, who is the head of the Russian-backed Donetsk regional government. Anyway, he's told TASS that with Natalevo under control, it is possible to keep under control a large part of the road to Pokrovsk. This road in particular is used to deliver supplies to Ukrainian forces in Selidovo, Kurakhovo, Ukrainsk, Novopavlovka, Novogrodovka, and other communities. By the way, Donetsk has been shelled from there for a long time, and of course he means by this Natalevo as well. So the Russians have confirmed that they control Natalevo. I believe that the Ukrainians have admitted that the other village of Umansky is now fully under Russian control. It looks like the Russians are preparing to attack another village in this area called Yasnobrodovka, and further north there are an accumulation of reports that they're storming the village of Novo-Alexandrovka on the way towards Pokrovsk, and that they are drawing closer to another village to the west of Ocheretino, the village of Sokol, which it's likely they will be attacking and perhaps storming at some point within the next 2 or 3 days. So, major Russian advance west of Avdiivka, and Ocheretino, and this advance, this push by Russian forces westwards from Ocheretino and Avdiivka is now bringing together Russian forces, that is joining up with the separate Russian advance that has been taking place from the south, from Marinka towards Krasnogorovka. The German journalist Julian Rebker, who writes for Bild Zeitung, German newspaper, now says that the Russians control around 60% of Krasnogorovka. I believe it is significantly more than this. I suspect that the reason Julian Rebker is saying this is because he's preparing his German readers for the prospect that Krasnogorovka, which, as I said, is being attacked by the Russians principally from the south, from Marinka, is about to fall. So the Russian advance westwards from Ocheretino and Avdiivka is about to combine with the Russian advance from the southeast, from Marinka through Krasnogorovka, and of course Kimakovsky, amongst the places that he spoke about, which the Russians could threaten through the capture of Natalevo. He mentioned Selidovo and Kurakhovo, and of course the Russians are advancing on those 2 places as well, also from the Marinka area. They've recently, or apparently they're about to capture the village of Paraskovievka to the southwest of Marinka, having recently, of course, captured Novomikhailovka. They're about to attack Konstantinovka, another village in that same area. Reports from the 79th Brigade that defending it appear to confirm this. And they've also apparently captured a village of Georgievka, or at least almost entirely captured a village of Georgievka, which lies close to Kurakhovo as well. In fact, what we're starting to see is a trend, which is that as the Russians start to break through all of these Russian or all these Ukrainian fortified positions, the various Russian groups of forces are beginning to meet up with each other, significantly further to the west of the previous line of contact. So we're starting to see how Russian forces pushing northeast from Ocheretino potentially can link up with Russian forces pushing southwest toward from Klashevka, and how and of course we've just seen how Russian forces pushing forward westwards from Ocheretino and Avdiivka are now linking up with Russian forces who have been advancing from a more southerly location in Marinka. Anyway, all of that is all very dramatic. It's not the only thing that's happening on the battlefronts. There's also reports that the Russians have recently captured, or at least close to capturing, the villages of Staromayorsk and Urozhaine in the Vremivka salient area. And this also is now being discussed by TASS, by the TASS news agency. And this time it's our old friend Vladimir Rogov from Zaporozhye, other Russian official who's bringing us an update. He says near Staromayorsk we see active advance in the northwestern and central parts of the community. There is also certain progress in Urozhaine. That's how the situation has changed over the past 24 hours. Our guys continue to move forward. And TASS says that he also informed them, this is Rogov, that the Russian army now controls the heights west of these communities. So, major Russian advance taking place all across the front line, with another Russian advance likely to follow very soon in Sumy region. And to reiterate again, the bulk of the Russian forces concentrated in this area still has not been committed. I'm starting to see more Russian units starting to appear, more line units from the regular Russian army. The forces who are fighting in Kharkiv region, as I said, appear to be line units drawn from the regular Russian military, specifically from the Leningrad military district, and we're starting to see other units like that also starting to appear on the front lines. But the bulk of the Russian forces, the tank and mechanized forces in Russia, the bulk of them have still not been fully committed to the battle. So, an appalling situation for Ukraine. I read a further report, a journalist, Western journalist, meeting up with Ukrainian soldiers, says that their average age is still 43 to 45. He said that he's met very few soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers who are under 30. Most of the young men under 30 do not want to fight, and there aren't that many of them to start with. And the men who are fighting in the army becoming increasingly exhausted, and the Ukrainian authorities' decision to cancel a promised demobilization of serving Ukrainian soldiers has been very badly received within the Ukrainian army, with many Ukrainian soldiers complaining about this and about the fact that they're in effect trapped in their units in what is looking like a losing war. So, a very bad situation overall. Now, it's likely to get worse. And I say that because Putin has just undertaken yet another in the unending string of very important meetings that he has been engaged in. So he comes back to Moscow from his meetings, his visits to Belarus. He stays in Moscow for a short time, and then, by the way, he flies on to Uzbekistan, where he's currently holding meetings with the Uzbek government. Interesting that he should have chosen Uzbekistan, but I suspect the Russians are going to make a major push to try to persuade Uzbekistan to join formally the Collective Security Treaty Organization and also the Eurasian Economic Union. I suspect that is what that's all about, but that's a topic for another day. But in the meantime, on his way, whilst he stops over in Moscow, between his trips to Belarus and Uzbekistan, he has a meeting in the Korolyov region with the CEOs of the various component parts of the now increasingly gigantic military-industrial complex. Now, we have a very, very interesting photographic study of this meeting, which has been provided to us by the Kremlin. We see that immediately to Putin's left, the person who is sitting there is none other than Sergei Shoigu, recently appointed Secretary of the Security Council, and clearly the man now in overall charge of the Russian military-industrial complex. To Putin's right is none other than Dmitry Medvedev, the Deputy Chair of the Security Council, until recently the man in nominal control of the military-industrial complex, but in fact that part of his duties has been transferred to Shoigu. Nonetheless, he clearly has an overwatch position because he's been seated in this meeting immediately to Putin's right. Now, to the left of Shoigu, we see Dumin, Alexei Dumin, recently appointed to the presidential administration, also with a job to keep monitoring the progress of the military-industrial complex. He's there, seating next to Shoigu. As I've said, there are rumors, there's talk that Dumin might one day be Putin's eventual choice for successor. But in the meantime, his job is to supervise the work of the military-industrial complex. And then on the other side, the side where Medvedev is sitting, to the right of Putin, we have a whole series of other officials. So immediately to the right of Medvedev, there is the Deputy Prime Minister in overall charge of the economy, who is now Denis Manturov. He, of course, is the former industry minister and the person who therefore had overall responsibility for military industrial production. To the left of Manturov is the newly appointed Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov. It's interesting that Belousov is, in other words, placed on the civilian side of the table. And, well, we have other officials as well. Alongside Belousov is Anton Siluanov, the finance minister. He has to make sure that whatever is agreed at this meeting is not going to impact on the budget. It's not going to throw the budget into excessive deficit. And Alikhanov, who is the new industry minister, well, he's also present as well. So, as is Chemezov, the head of Rostec, the giant corporation that brings together the entirety of Russia's military-industrial complex, its major enterprises. Anyway, Putin discusses the situation in the military-industrial complex, and he talks about the enormous increase in production that has taken place. From 2021 to 2023, these figures change constantly. They're increasing. The growth was more than 22 times for missile and artillery weapons, 15 times for electronic warfare and reconnaissance equipment, 14 times for ammunition and munitions, 7 times for vehicles, 6 times for body armor equipment, 4 times for aviation equipment and unmanned aerial vehicles, and almost 3.5 times for tanks and armored vehicles. This is a good pace and large volume. I would like to thank you and your teams for coping with these formidable challenges. The major takeaway to take from this meeting is that if you read it through carefully, it's clear that this massive increase in production of war material is envisaged as permanent. It was triggered by the needs of the special military operation, but it is clearly going to continue beyond that. And in other words, Russia is now rearming, and it is rearming for the long term, not just for the needs of the special military operation. And this is, again, clearly the explanation for the recent government reshuffle. Putin again goes on to talk about the importance of ensuring that the growth of military industrial production strengthens the civilian economy rather than simply taking away resources from it. And he talks about the crossover between the two types of industrial activity, and he says things like this: I would like to draw your attention to diversifying the operations of our defense manufacturers to launch high-tech production of civilian manufacturing. This is what I have just spoken about. Delivering on the systemic objective is instrumental for streamlining the defense sector's manufacturing potential and helping talented professionals advance their careers. This would create a more sustainable footing for defense manufacturers by offering them a solid economic and financial foundation in the long run. What he's saying is that if manufacturing, industrial plants committed to manufacturing are also able to sell goods on the civilian market, this will help their own financial position as well, making their economic position, their overall economic position, stronger. So that's what Putin is saying. So that's the plan. But the key thing to say, again, is that this is clearly, as I said, a long-term project. The Russians have concluded that the geopolitical situation with the West is so bad that they need to rearm in ways that they have not done since the end of the Cold War. They need to build up their conventional forces as well as their nuclear forces. They need to enhance their space programs and all of that. Now, given that this is a long-term plan with more output increases almost certainly coming. We can see how the balance of military power on the Ukrainian battlefields is going to continue to shift further and further in Russia's favor and ever more against Ukraine's. But of course, it is also going to deepen the overall crisis the West is facing, in that it is looking at a build-up by the Russians in Russia and in Europe at exactly the same time that the Chinese are building up their forces in the Pacific in order to counter the challenge that they see coming from the United States. And I have to say, talking about such challenges from the United States, I read a most bizarre, indeed extremely alarming article in the Daily Mail, which appeared over the weekend. And it spoke about how US Marines are now clearly training for a war against China in various islands belonging to the Philippines. Some of these islands apparently within sight of Taiwan itself. And the article sort of accepted that in this area, fighting China, the United States would be at a certain disadvantage because they would be fighting China close to China's own logistics bases. But they appear to think that with the Philippines on side, this problem has been redressed to some extent. The point about the article is that it seemed to take the prospect of a war between the United States and China incredibly calmly, in a very sanguine way, as if this is something that is all but inevitable, is all but bound to happen now. I have to say that I find this unbelievably astonishing and incredibly alarming, but it is consistent with another equally alarming article I read. I think it was in Foreign Policy just the other day. I believe it was co-authored, as I remember, by a man called Ariel Cohen, whom I followed many times. He is a person who takes views which, even by neocon standards, I would say are at the extreme limit of what even neocons look like they're prepared to do. But anyway, just as US forces are rehearsing battles in the Philippines, on the island chains of the Philippines, to fight China, he advocates what looked to me, in Foreign Policy as well, what looked to me like, in effect, an unrestricted war against Russia. Of course, it'll be the Ukrainians who are expected to wage it, but they'll be given the green light. They can attack wherever they want, basically whatever they want in Russia using Western weapons. The West is supposed to intensify its own pressure simultaneously on Russia in all sorts of extraordinary ways. This apparently is the way to reverse the course of the war, to turn things round, to change the pattern from one of gathering defeat towards ultimate victory. All of this is beyond reckless. It explains why the Chinese and the Russians are coming together, but it also explains the recent decisions that the governments in China and Moscow are taking, and it explains this meeting that Putin has just had with the defense industry chiefs. So, a long-term rearmament in Russia. And it's happening simultaneously with a clear out of people in the defense ministry. Now, over the last couple of weeks, a string of officials have been arrested who held what might be called desk positions at the defense ministry in Moscow. In several cases, they've been charged with corruption. In one case, a specific general who was on the front lines, has, as far as I can see, been cashiered for bungling operations in the Vuhledar area. I gather he's been dishonorably discharged from the armed forces. Quite an astonishing thing. If we think about it, I can't remember a single case in recent years that has happened to any Western general, even though our military record in all our recent wars has been far from stellar, to put it mildly. But anyway, it seems that one Russian general has now been cashiered. And one other Russian general, General Popov, who was apparently a successful frontline commander. He's also facing corruption charges, though he is contesting them. And he was apparently a rather popular commander with his men. And there does seem to be some sympathy for him and some attempts, at least, to try and change the situation and to try to defend him in the case that has been brought against him. Now, many people are seeing all of this again as an attempt to clip the wings of the former defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. And it's been suggested that Shoigu is the ultimate target of what people are calling a purge. And it's also been suggested that all of these officials are somehow connected to Shoigu, and that Shoigu himself fostered an atmosphere of corruption within the defense ministry. Now, I ought to say, going back to this meeting of defense industry officials, that this is not the impression I'm getting from the study, the photographic study. On the contrary, Shoigu is given unusual prominence. He is the only official who is shown, apart from Putin himself, sitting entirely by himself in this meeting. It appears to be done in a way that's intended to specifically draw attention to him. So it doesn't look to me as if Shoigu is in any type of disgrace. And in terms of the corruption charges which have been brought against these various officials, I'm going to say that in several cases at least, they look like the investigations of these men began at the very least some months ago, probably a year ago, and it is quite likely that they have been green-lighted by Shoigu himself. Now, I suspect what has happened is that, as is often the way, the war has intensified scrutiny over the behavior of some officials in the defense ministry, and that a decision was made to cut out the dead wood, to arrest these people, and to make it absolutely clear that corruption in future, even minor league corruption, which some of this might be, is not going to be tolerated in the defense ministry from now on. Not just because there's a war underway which Russia must win, but because Russia again finds itself in a long-term military confrontation with the West. So I'm not saying that Shoigu himself isn't connected to all of this. It's likely that these arrests were to some extent timed with the announcement of his leaving the defense ministry. Probably more likely, I think, it was all done in order to highlight the reasons for Belousov's appointment, the need to have somebody in charge of the defense ministry who's able to monitor and keep watch on these things. But anyway, I think, for the record, that this is a sign that, as I said, the Russians are preparing for a new long-term confrontation with the West. Now, before I leave the question of militaries, I just wanted to say that I also saw reports yesterday that the Ukrainian General Staff is apparently now going to reduce its staffing by something like 60%, and that all the Ukrainian soldiers, all the Ukrainian senior officers who were parts of the General Staff up to this time are going to be reassigned to the front lines. That, I have to say, looks much more like a purge to me, than a political purge to me, than what we're seeing in Moscow. And if it is true that General Syrskyi, that his job is now also on the line, as rumors from Kiev imply, then that would indeed confirm that another purge of the military is about to take place. Just a few weeks after we saw the first purge, the previous purge, after General Zaluzhny was sacked. Anyway, there we are. So the Russians preparing for a long-term face-off with the West, the Chinese obviously doing so too, the United States still coming up with reckless ideas about how to win the war in Ukraine, though I think, as I said, it is widely understood by most people that it is lost, and still looking for long-term confrontation with Russia, and perhaps actively now planning for war with China as well. The entire peace that seemed to be within humanity's grasp in the late 1980s has now been apparently irretrievably lost. The entire great power system has gone from a position of potential cooperation, which, it must be said, was never fully realized, towards total conflict. Now, some people are already talking about nuclear war on the horizon. And I have to say, if the disastrous rhetoric of people like Cohen is implemented, it's difficult to see how we can avoid that outcome. We are already seeing incredibly dangerous plans, I've discussed them in many programs, to floating around to give Ukraine the green light to launch missile strikes using Western missiles, guided missiles, onto Russian positions, deep inside Russia itself. I think many people are in denial about this, continue to be in denial about the likely Russian reaction. I've had several emails about this, people still insisting that the Russians always sit back and allow these things to happen, and that they're going to sit on their hands and let themselves have missiles hurled at them and will do nothing when this takes place. Again, people who talk in this way, I think, is overly influenced by rhetoric about the West having been able to cross Russian red lines. I've already said in previous programs that the red lines people are talking about were never Russian red lines. They were red lines which the West imposed on itself and then decided to cross and then pretended that they were Russian red lines. But to repeat again, if guided missiles, cruise missiles, Western cruise missiles, which by definition require guidance, assistance with guidance from the West, are launched at Russia, then this is an escalation beyond anything we have seen up to this time. And to reiterate again, multiple launch rocket systems fired from Ukrainian territory using Czech vampires, completely different quality of weapon, even drone attacks on the Armavir radar station. And by the way, I've seen analysis that the damage to Armavir was superficial, which it almost certainly was. Anyway, drone attacks like that, pinprick attacks like that, certainly not meriting the kind of extreme reaction that some people are expecting from the Russians and saying would amount to weakness from the Russians if it didn't happen. The Russians behaved in the way that some people are suggesting. What most countries around the world would conclude is that the Russians had taken leave of their senses, and that would probably rapidly result in an international consensus uniting against them. But anyway, put that aside. The point is that attacks with cruise missiles on Russian territory are completely different escalation from any one that we have seen up to now. Now, some governments in the West are beginning to warn against them. The Italian government has made absolutely clear that it opposes this plan. The German government, for once, has come out and spoken out against it as well. Olaf Scholz has made several commentaries to this effect. He's made several speeches. Well, of course, Scholz has changed position several times. But my impression is that this time, the German government is united in supporting him on this, and that he does indeed speak for a united government on this question. Even in the British media today, I noticed that there was an article in the Daily Telegraph which said that the Ukrainian drone attack on Armavir was a mistake not because of the damage it did to Armavir, which is minimal, nor because of this is something different from what the Ukrainians have done, but it's a mistake because it calls into doubt the wisdom of green-lighting Ukrainian missile strikes on Russian territory. If they're prepared to launch missile strikes like that against early warning radars of the Russian strategic forces, then it's better, given the risks, that were not done. So there's been pushback, but the fact is that even if there is pushback, we can have no confidence that this is not going to be followed through, and the risks of that kind of escalation remain very great. Now, I ought to say one commentator who has written to me, has spoken about how Putin has already walked back some of his previous threats, and that he has apparently said that Russia is opposed to any uncontrolled escalation, which supposedly is coming from Putin, a walking back of those threats. I have to say, I think that this is a complete misunderstanding of what Putin has said. It was something he said over the course of his press conference in Minsk. He was asked about the nuclear drills. He said that what we are doing is a scheduled routine drill. We have to keep our tactical forces ready. We are not aiming for an escalation or anything, but as we said, this needs to be practiced. Now, the Kremlin readout doesn't speak about a uncontrolled escalation. He says we are not aiming for an escalation, but this needs to be practiced because clearly the situation in the world today is becoming a dangerous one. The Russians are acting with restraint, but it is not a restraint that amounts to some kind of take it to the other side, to do what they like, and that is absolutely not the meaning of what Putin said. Well, what will the West do? Will they give the Ukrainians the permission to launch the missile strikes on Russia? My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou thinks that the decision to do that has already been made. Presumably, in that case, it was made at the time of the ATACMS delivery. In February, the decision to make the ATACMS delivery, which was made in February, presumably in connection with the news of the fall of Avdiivka and the collapse of the narrative that the war in Ukraine was in stalemate. Well, I don't know what Western governments are going to do. There are some signs of pushback. Two Western governments, the German and Italian government clearly opposed, the British and the French government silent, the American government going through its own internal debate, probably people in the Pentagon opposed, clearly people in the State Department in favor. Always the president himself has chosen the most dangerous option, the most escalatory option. In my opinion, we will see what he does on this occasion. But anyway, one way or the other, the situation is becoming more dangerous, obviously, but no one is in any doubt that the war is lost or is being lost. And in the meantime, as I said previously, the Russians now clearly planning and preparing for a long-term and permanent build-up. None of this, obviously, remotely in the interests of the United States. And we're getting news that confirms this fact every single day. The de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, Prime Minister and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has just announced that he's now going to travel to Iran. He's going to have meetings in Tehran with the Iranian leadership. This is directly shortly after the death of the Iranian president, Ebrahim Raisi. He obviously wants to meet with the new leaders of Iran to make sure that they remain committed to the rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Now, the point about that meeting is it's taking place even as the United States has been doing whatever it can to persuade the Saudis to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. The Saudis, instead, as we see, even as they string the Americans along, are continuing with their rapprochement with Iran. That's just one example of one major power distancing itself from the United States. The Western powers also now facing the collapse of their conference in Switzerland over Ukraine. All the key people are staying away, and there's an article now in Bloomberg saying that the EU is trying to find means to retrieve something from the conference in Switzerland. It's no longer, in other words, a conference that is going to put the West in a decisive position. It's now become a damage limitation exercise. Apparently, the latest plan is to accept that this conference isn't going to come up with anything of substance, but to try to set up another conference in a few months' time in Saudi Arabia, this time with the Russians invited. Maybe they are going to be invited, maybe not. But anyway, a rebooting of the whole process. No real thought as to why this whole process has failed from the outset. The fact that the global majority ultimately does not agree with Western policy over Ukraine. And lots of similar things like that going on in all sorts of places around the world. Brazil and China, for example, coming together to agree a common position on peace in Ukraine with each other, cutting out the West and Ukraine, and in effect ignoring the conference in Switzerland. And Argentina, under the maverick president, Mr. Milei, now deciding that antagonizing China maybe wasn't such a good idea after all, and sending a strong delegation to Beijing to talk about somehow repairing ties. This is, as I said, the drift in the world, and it's going to continue like this. There'll be discussions within the BRICS forums about creating a global trade and financial architecture. The Russians, and before long the Chinese, are going to move forward with their plan to create their own rival versions of the Starlink system. I suspect that once that's established, it will be possible, by the way, to receive broadcasts directly from Russia anywhere in the West. This despite whatever restrictions the European Union or the United States seek to impose. Just saying. So, a global situation that's changing, but changing in a very negative way. As I said, with this move slowly towards military confrontation. I am personally deeply embittered by this. I remember the hopes that were so widespread in the late 1980s, when it did seem as if a real effort was being made to end the Cold War. We really do seem to be in a situation of a lost peace, and we really do seem to be moving towards a position of outright confrontation between the two great power blocs, or two rival systems of great powers. But what I think Western governments need to understand is that this time it is going to be profoundly different from what happened in the previous Cold War. In the Cold War confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, it was not just that the West had what many people around the world felt was the more attractive ideology and way of life. Not everybody thought that way, of course, but perhaps a critical mass of people did. What was much more important is that the Soviet Union and its allies, economically, industrially, technologically, were outmatched by the West. Not so decisively, perhaps, in technological terms, but definitely so in economic and ultimately industrial terms. This time, it is the other way round. It is the West that is outmatched economically and industrially by the other side. It is the other side that is arguably putting forward the more attractive agenda, and it is the other side that has unquestionably the superior statecraft. If, or rather when, the war in Ukraine ends in defeat, and we have to assume that that will happen without us getting involved in some kind of cataclysmic event. I don't want to even think about. But when that happens, it will not be the first defeat or the last. Many more like that will follow. Some perhaps on an even greater scale. It is to that point where this catastrophic failure in Western statecraft and this malign domination of foreign policy by the neocons has brought us. Well, on that somber note, I finish this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.